Guten Nachmittag, ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zu dieser Veranstaltung, Gesprächsrunde zum Thema Commonism. Mein Name ist Astrid Wege, ich arbeite im Goethe-Institut Moskau und habe das Vergnügen, diese Runde hier zu moderieren. Das Gespräch wird auf Deutsch und Englisch stattfinden. Wer Übersetzung braucht, kann sich jetzt noch ein Headset holen. Now switch to English. Good afternoon to this panel discussion on communism. My name is Astrid Wege from the Goethe-Institut Moscow, and I have the pleasure to moderate this panel discussion. If you need translation, the talk will be in English and German, so you can get headsets at the door. So our topic today is communism, which is a neologism, a combination of two words. On one hand, communism, and on the other hand, commons, which plays a major role in the present debates on sharing economy, and just means collectively used or owned resources, goods, and ideas. And this combination leads to the core or topic of today. So if one assumes that in the 21st century in Western societies, property and possessions seem to have become less important, not to all, of course, but at least to so many that one can speak of a trend, then some questions arise. What about the countries where socialism prevailed and which have in the 1990s undergone a major change, system change, from a state-run economy to free market economy? What did sharing mean in the socialist countries, and what does sharing mean today in the post-socialist countries? And are there parallels between what was considered common property in socialist countries and today's sharing economy? These are the topics we will discuss today, and I'm very honored and pleased to have three distinguished guests together with me here, and I'd like to introduce them. So, next to me is Ivars Ijabs. He comes from Latvia, a former Soviet republic which gained independence after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mr. Ijabs is a political scientist and an associate professor at the University of Latvia. His research interests include the history of politics, political ideas, nationalism, as well as inter-ethnic relations in Central and Eastern Europe. He's author of several books and on Latvian politics and political theory, and he is also writes for a regular column in the Latvian magazine Ivars Ijabs. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Okay, good. He's the vice president for professional development of the Association of the Advancement of Baltic Studies, and in Latvia one can say that he's one of the most well-known political and cultural commentators. Next to him is Viktor Misano. Viktor Misano is a well-known curator and art theorist. He has worked in museums like the Pushkin Museum in Moscow or the Center of Contemporary Art. He also, as a freelance curator, has curated major biennials like the First Manifesto in Rotterdam or the Russian Pavilion for the Venice Biennial or the Central Asian Pavilion for the Venice Biennial, and also the Russian section of the Istanbul Biennial. He is, which is very important, also the founder of an art magazine, the Moscow Art Magazine in 1993, which is key to give access to informations on art, contemporary art in Russia and abroad. So a very important magazine to bridge actually and give access to information. And he's also founder and chief editor of the Manifesto magazine, journal. I also welcome Herrn Carsten Schneider. I switch to German now. Carsten Schneider ist Mitglied des Bundestages seit 1998 für den Wahlkreis erst Erfurt und jetzt Erfurt und Weimar. Hält viele politische Funktionen inne. Ich erwähne nur ein paar wenige, sonst wäre die Liste sehr lang. Er ist stellvertretender Vorsitzender der SPD-Bundestagsfraktion für Haushalt, Finanzen und Euro, Vorsitzender des Vertrauensgremiums zur Kontrolle des Haushalts der Geheimdienste, stellvertretendes Mitglied im Haushalts- und im Finanzausschuss, das sind zwei verschiedene Ausschüsse, stellvertretendes Mitglied im Ausschuss für die Angelegenheiten der Europäischen Union, Vorstands- oder Senatsmitglied der Fraunhofer Gesellschaft und er ist auch sehr engagiert, ehrenamtlich, unter anderem habe ich gelesen, im Verein Erfurt Rennt. Und was uns als Goethe-Institut natürlich interessiert oder besonders freut auch, er ist Mitglied im Kuratorium des Vereins Bauhaus Weimar Moderne. Das sind unsere drei Gäste heute und ich würde direkt anfangen mit der ersten Frage. So my first question to all of you is, what did sharing mean in formerly socialist countries and what changes have come about in the wake of the privatizations in the 1990s? And maybe, Mr. Ijabs, you would like to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. At first, I would like to thank the Goethe-Institut and all the partners for the opportunity of being here. These have been really 3 wonderful days. But let me start with 3 points on the question, what about the sharing experiences in post-socialist countries? The first point is an obvious one. Just like the introduction of free market economy, also the introduction of sharing economy is very much dependent, and its success is very much dependent on the local historical and cultural context. And as you probably know, these communist societies of the 20th century have been very much based on a certain form of sharing. I remember many examples of the Russian and Soviet literature where the communist regime begins with people coming to some kind of middle class family's flat or house and making to share the house or making to share the flat in a forcible, violent manner. So these societies have had a lot of sharing in a typical communist sense of the word, and that's why after the communism broke down, there was a certain backlash. These societies, especially those people who have been through the, let's say, communist era, and those who were middle-aged or something like that, were very much attached to exclusive use of things like cars or flats or private property in the general sense of the 19th century liberalism, private property as a basis of happiness and so on and so forth. And that's why when we are now coming to sharing economy, you can see a very much diverse attitude towards different types of sharing institutions. For example, in my home country, which is Latvia, we have a lot of different initiatives devoted for sharing. For example, I'm a board member of an organization which has this open office or let's say office space which is accessible to everyone. We have wonderful initiatives also in sharing and use of non-inhabited empty buildings and so on and so forth. But at the same time, of course, the general attitude of society is very, especially the oldest generation, is very much modern in a sense that the exclusive use of property is a very high value because of certain historical and cultural reasons. The second point is, of course, we had, during the Soviet era, certain types of sharing, which was not only based on this kind of authoritarian socialist state, but which was also based on people voluntary activities. Like there is a famous book by Alexei Yurchak about the last Soviet generation, which is very good when he tells the story of how the samizdat publications were circulating, how these LPs and records and films and books were circulating in certain circles of friends. These experiences have been actually very important to people who are living right now in post-Soviet and post-socialist countries. And this was really a very important sharing experience, because the sharing experience was also a community building experience, like people who are in love with jazz, for example, in these countries, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I would say that this is a very, let's say, non-typical way of sharing in free market democracies, because these sharing communities have been based on face-to-face relationship, on mutual trust with people whom you know personally. This is a person whom I can trust, and that's why I'm giving him, let's say, my samizdat copy of Solzhenitsyn's Archipelago Gulag. When this was not the case, and when this trust was lacking, then, of course, no sharing took place. So there are many different kinds of sharing and sharing of communities. And the third point I just wanted to mention as a political scientist, I would say that for political science in general, this is a very crucial question, how the growing popularity of sharing economy is affecting the state capacity and a democracy in general. Because if we are looking to the countries to the east, I'm not talking just about these so-called new member states or something like that, but also to countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and indeed Russia itself, you see that there is a very limited, despite being different kinds of democratic arrangements, these countries are sometimes struggling with huge problems of state capacity, which means fighting corruption, collection of taxes, promotion of free market economy, rule of law, and so on and so forth. These problems are very typical to these countries, to different extent, but still. And now we could speculate about the fact how the sharing economy would affect this state capacity. Look at different kinds of initiatives like Uber or Airbnb, or if you want Bitcoin, for example. How do you tax Bitcoin transactions? Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and this affects, of course, the state capacity. So we should find and think about such arrangements of the statehood and democracy in these countries which wouldn't diminish the state capacity, because lack of state capacity very much influences in these Eastern European countries also the very legitimacy of the democratic regime. So these are my 3 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think this really opens up the floor for many other questions, and I saw that both of you sometimes agreed, so would you maybe directly catch up? Mr. Schneider, you said it's an interesting point, the question about state capacity in relation to sharing economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to speak in German because it's my mother tongue, so, and it's my home place here, so I would like to do it in German if it's possible. Also die Frage, yeah, that's why I said it. Yeah. Also, I've learned some Russian, but I'm not fluent enough after 6 years in school. Zunächst mal, ich teile absolut die Analyse, was diese Tauschhandlung betrifft. Also es war ja mehr Laien. Ich hatte da selbst, also es gab natürlich die Literatur, die politische Literatur, wobei, ich komme hier aus Ostdeutschland, die russischen Zeitungen waren, die offener waren als die deutschen, sodass es schwieriger war, an die russischen Zeitschriften zu kommen. Und viele Ostdeutsche auch Russisch sowieso lernen mussten, aber auch gern gelesen haben, um überhaupt an Informationen zu kommen, die ein bisschen eine breitere Debatte hatten, als das in der SED-Zeitung möglich war. Und es war natürlich so, dass ein Großteil der Tausch- und Teilegeschäfte auch Geschäfte waren, auf Gegenseitigkeit. Also diese Vertrauensfrage, die Sie angesprochen haben, stimmt. Natürlich leihen Sie jemand nur ein Werkzeug, wenn Sie sicher sind, Sie kriegen es wieder. Und das hat sich dann über die Zeit herausgestellt, wem man vertrauen kann und wem nicht. Und es hat sich schon eine Gemeinschaft herausgebildet, die viele Ostdeutsche heute noch verklären als den Teil des Sozialismus, der besonders gut war, weil man hat sich gekümmert. Wenn es also Tomaten gab, hat man dem anderen welche mitgebracht. Aber die Erwartung war schon, dass wenn der andere was sieht, dass er was mitbringt. Also es war nicht ganz so altruistisch, wie es jetzt in vielen, also zumindest in der ostdeutschen Gesellschaft, ich weiß es nicht, wie es in Lettland ist, verklärt wird die Zeit des Sozialismus. Der zweite Punkt, also das eine war das Leihen, Zeitschriften, Dinge, die man sich dann eben ausgetauscht hat, LPs, bei mir waren es die Kassetten, die man dann aufgenommen hat im Radio und dann dem anderen gegeben hat, damit er sie überspielen konnte und dann auch die Musik hatte. Das hat das Gemeinschaftsgefühl natürlich gestärkt, aber es war auch auf einer marktwirtschaftlichen Basis von Angebot und Nachfrage. Und der nichts zum Teilen hatte, der hat irgendwann auch nichts mehr bekommen. Und auch die Tauschgeschäfte, ich meine, es gab viel Geld, sie konnten nur von dem Geld nichts kaufen. Und deswegen waren die Ersatzteile, also die Fähigkeiten, die sie hatten, ich zum Beispiel wollte zu DDR-Zeiten Kfz-Mechaniker werden. Warum? Weil man als Kfz-Mechaniker attraktiv war, weil man die Autos reparieren konnte nach Feierabend. Und damit andere Produkte, Güter bekam, Westgeld zum Beispiel, von dem man sich das kaufen konnte, was man wollte. Es wäre für mich nicht attraktiv gewesen, Bankkaufmann zu werden, was ich nach der Wende wurde, sondern ich bin technisch leider unbegabt, ich hätte das trotzdem versucht zu lernen. Es hätte also auch in dieser Bewegung hätte es mein Leben bestimmt. Aber es war immer auf einer Basis, hatte man Zugang zu begehrten Gütern, die unter dem Tisch, unter der Ladentheke gehandelt wurden. Dann war man drin, hatte man das nicht, war man auch so ein armer Schlucker. Und was die Besteuerungsfrage betrifft, da bin ich in der Tat sehr interessiert daran, weil wir natürlich durch die Digitalisierung, die ja so, Rifkin, ein bisschen was habe ich davon gelesen, auch von seinem Buch, seine Idealisierung, die er dort, er war ja auch hier am Mittwoch, glaube ich, zur Eröffnung, dass das jetzt alles zu null Grenzkosten allen verfügbar ist und so weiter. Ich bin sehr skeptisch, was diese Plattform anbetrifft, was Uber anbetrifft, aber auch was andere digitale Plattformen anbetrifft, weil sie uns Steuersubstrat entziehen. Also nehmen Sie nur, Sie sind ja alle hier in Hotels untergebracht. Diese Hotels wurden früher vermittelt, Sie haben angerufen oder Sie haben an der Touristinformation angerufen und heute buchen Sie es bei Booking.com oder bei HHS oder bei anderen. Das heißt aber, das kostet 20% die Vermittlung. Die Preise sind nicht höher. Das heißt, der Ertrag, geht in die USA oder in Niedrigsteuergebiete. Das heißt, wir verlieren hier in Deutschland, haben wir nur noch die Gebäude, aber der Gewinn ist nicht mehr da. Das heißt, irgendwann wird auch die Frage der Reinvestition sich stellen. Und die Frage von der Besteuerung von digitalen Unternehmen ist eine, die wir gerade ganz aktuell im Rahmen, nennt sich BEPS, OECD-Prozess, umsetzen wollen, im G20-Rahmen auch, dass wir solche Unternehmen auch dort besteuern, wo sie ihren Gewinn machen und erarbeiten, weil ansonsten entziehe ich der gesamten Volkswirtschaft letztendlich das Unternehmenseinkommen, die Besteuerung des Unternehmenseinkommens und habe nur noch zur Grundlage die Arbeit und die Mehrwertsteuer. Und das ist in weiten Teilen ungerecht, weil sie dann die Arbeit und Kapital, der klassische Widerspruch oder Gegensatz nicht nur der Frage, wie ist der Preis, sondern auch, wer zahlt hier eigentlich die Steuern und unterhält das Land in den Mittelpunkt rückt. Und das ist schon etwas, was ich zumindest kritisch betrachte und ein sehr genauen Auge auch drauf habe.
Thank you. Now we are already in the present. I'd like to go back one step again and hear the perspective from Viktor Misano, what sharing meant in Soviet times. And in an email conversation before this panel, you wrote that in real socialism, did not know commons, which is quite a provocative statement.
Yeah, in fact, when I was reading the presentation of our discussion today, in the short note, so it was taken for granted that socialist experience is an experience of domination of common. And in fact, my initial impulse was to put it into the doubt, because what we knew, definitely knew very well, that was public. And in fact, I'm feeling quite uncomfortable in this company in a sense that I'm not sociologist and politologist, and I'm just a citizen who simply experience social past, because my professional occupation is focused on completely different issues. But but as someone who witnessed that time, yes, I would say we lived public. Everything was public. Nothing, or very tiny space, was delivered for the private. But public, according to my knowledge, public, it's not common. Opposite, those who are claiming nowadays for common, they are contraposing it to public. And in fact, common, as rightfully was said before, it's something what we are sharing anthropologically. It's something what we are building together in face-to-face, vis-a-vis relations. And in between us, in our social past, Soviet past, in between us and not private public property, it was always a subject, an entity. You can name it the state, you can name it communist regime, we can name it big other. So it was something always in between, which was absolutely not allowing us to build private relations. Your remark to Alexei Yurchak, it's absolutely rightful, because in his brilliant book, he really identified many forms of spontaneously organized common spaces. Most of all the spaces, like clubs, like sometimes half underground communities, those who practiced yoga, or those who practiced tantra sex, or those who studied Hebrew, or those, well, in reality, the whole Soviet society was in reality cutted into the small communities of those who were self-organizing because of some common interest. And paradoxically, Soviet system was not, how to say, was in some way even promoting it. Because despite this obsession with big other, with building and controlling everything throughout public structures, a genuine communist idea of 20s in some way survived, in some way really survived. So we can explain my 70s and 80s experience throughout Leninist 20s. Then, of course, I totally agree. Enormous chain of alternative exchanges were built in response to inefficiency of the public. So I can help your son to become a pupil of a musical school, but in exchange, you will find me a pair of American blue jeans Levi's, for example. From many points of view, we can say that that was a pre-capitalist form of relations, because in the focus was always an object of consume, or a need which needed to be satisfied. But in the same time, in reality, we can't say that it was a market relation. I give you that, but you immediately should give me something back. No, in reality, compensation could come later. And while you was doing this offer to another subject, I don't want yet to use the word friend, to another subject, it was obviously presumed that you should compensate it. But someday, and with something, we don't yet know with what. In fact, this phenomenon is, according to my poor knowledge of philosophy, it was identified as a political friendship. Sociologist Baltansky, sociologist and not artist Baltansky, Astrid, who is his brother, by the way. So sociologist Baltansky identified as agape. He uses Greek terminology. It's mean that in reality, this form of exchanges, as they are not dominated and controlled by capitalist rationality, they are in reality very flexible. Compensation is always suspended, like in friendship. we are giving something to another person, obviously we know, or we expecting him sometime to help us. But we are not asking compensation immediately, and we are not calculating him, even if Aristotle wanted it and suggested it. So this is a friendship. So this dimension of friendship was crucially important. And by the way, from my point of view, in post-Soviet time, in communist time, when public collapsed, when private came yet, I mean, we survived only thanks for these accumulated connections. We survived because we together built up new forms of relations, and we saved society. We saved our life in some way, if you want. But from my point of view, the weakest point of this condition is that it was never ever evaluated in Soviet time, and first of all in post-Soviet time. It was always what we can identify as common or pre-common, or a compromise not properly developed but still genuinely common, was always considered to be complementary to inefficient to the state, which should work much better, or in post-Soviet time, a complementary to the market economy, which did not came yet. So practicing common, we were always expecting or public or private. And not by chance, some of us who were mostly more efficient in this alternative private form of exchange became hyper-rich, became oligarchs. And thanks for the fact that we survived, public came back. In my country's minimum, in this precise moment, public and private, it's practically the same body. And from my point of view, the main problem is that we really did not appreciate it enough, these resources of the common. Even now, when we are just witnessed very well, what does it mean, public-private cooperation in the form of oligarchical state and authoritarian political regime, we still are absolutely unconscious about this experience, which is still with us, still in our memory. In some forms, it's still with us. And paradoxically, my last remark is, when common as a value, it's coming back to post-communist space, it's coming as a Western fashion, as a Western intellectual trick, something very, very cool, but which has nothing to do with us, despite the obvious fact that for we have a copyright for communism.
Okay, we are sitting here exactly for talking, not importing ideas, but bringing them together. So what I found interesting in all your three statements actually is that on one hand, sharing in socialist communist times has been utilitarian. It was in a, let's say, economy of deficit, a necessity. So nothing about, well, let's say, only friendship. But at the same time, you all also emphasized that it had some kind of community building elements or aspects. And what would be interesting is how does it look like today? Victor already started to talk about a bit, but it would be interesting to hear your point of view in a unified Germany now. So what are the residues here of this sharing experience from former times, and also, of course, in Latvia?
Ja, ich habe gerade noch darüber nachgedacht, was das sein könnte, aber ich weiß nicht, ob Sie den Begriff Eckbau kennen. Eckbau, ist das bekannt? Nee. Ich weiß ja nicht, wie man das übersetzen soll. Es ist Schwarzarbeit nach Feierabend, aber nicht bezahlt, sondern Sie helfen dem einen, sein Einfamilienhaus fertig zu bauen, und danach helfen Sie dem anderen, das Einfamilienhaus auch fertig zu machen. So kannte ich das, so hat es mein Vater auch gemacht, er war Elektriker. Und das ging natürlich auch nur, indem sie Vertrauen zu der Person hatten und dem ein Jahr geholfen haben. Und sie wussten ja nicht, wann kriegen sie das Haus oder wann war die Renovierung dran. Und sie brauchten vielleicht 5 Jahre, wie es eben beschrieben wurde. Und sie wussten also nicht, wann kommt die Gegenleistung. Aber sie kam. Und man konnte sich auch darauf verlassen. Und ich glaube, dass diese Form heute noch da ist, rudimentärer, als das früher war. Aber durch die Person, dass sie sich kennen, ist das Vertrauen natürlich auch da noch da. Und mal simpel gesagt, die Löhne hier in Thüringen sind sehr niedrig. Also ich hatte gerade einen Rentner bei mir in einer Bürgersprechstunde, der bekommt 1.000 Euro brutto nach 47 Jahren Beitrag. Der hat also 1.700 Euro verdient als Schriftsetzer. Von 1.700 Euro brutto, also netto 1.200, und der hat ein Haus, kann der sich niemals einen Klempner oder Elektriker leisten. Das ist nicht möglich, weil allein mit den Nebenkosten und so weiter, Stundenlohn, geht nicht. Von daher ist es heute immer noch so, dass Sie bei den geringeren Einkommen was im privaten Bereich zu 80% Tauschgeschäfte haben, wo sie ihnen jemand hilft. Ich würde jetzt dass also auch noch diese Form der Substitutionswirtschaft noch fortbesteht. Das, glaube ich, ist der Fall und es wächst wahrscheinlich, wenn man ein paar Trends noch weiter sieht, Ernährungsfrage, es gibt ja diesen Trend jetzt so wieder Urban Gardening. Im Spiegel war ein großer Artikel über New York. Ich sehe, dass die Datschen wiederkommen, also die Leute wieder ihren kleinen Garten auch haben wollen und das selber anbauen wollen. Solche Trends gibt es jetzt auch wieder und sie bauen auf der Erfahrung auf von früher. So würde ich das beschreiben.
Ja, back to the question about this. I mean, this Soviet experience should not be idealized, in my view, because we are basically here also not in a history seminar. I would say there were many diverse forms. Of course, many of these groups had a certain type of self-professed ideological mission. And they were very much intolerant towards other groups because there was no open competition in the public sphere. Let's say there are people who love jazz regarded those people who love, let's say, northern Indian classical music as complete idiots and so on and so forth. There is this certain culture of intolerance between these competing groups, although many of them weren't based on any kind of market relations. For example, there is a famous example in the Latvian history, is a so-called French group. I know personally some of their members. These were people who were in the late 1950s were very much devoted to reading and translation of the French poetry, which was still regarded in Khrushchev's times as a being kind of subversive and so on and so forth. And so that was very much a kind of non-market creative activity, and they were at the very end of the day they were sent to Siberia for something like 7 or 8 years. But if we are coming back to this question of personal relations, what Viktor talked about, this is really crucial because you see that also in my country, in Latvia, these old relations, friendships, affiliations, common memories, common structures, and so on and so forth play a huge role, basically. If you look at the Latvian political elite, right now it's probably a little changed, but let's say 10 years ago, there were 2 structures where these people came from. The first one was Komsomol, without any doubt, the kind of communist youth organization. And the second one was professional or semi-professional athletics, because all these basketball teams and so on and so forth also built a certain type of trust communities. But at the same time, I mean, we are sometimes, especially in Eastern Europe, overcritical towards these trust communities and towards these small circles of people who are kind of kept together by mutual relations and mutual trust. But there is a very interesting theory in social capital theories which says that in order to create a democratic state, it's not necessary to break all these personal relations. First of all, it's not possible. But what is needed is to somehow connect these personal relationships and these friendship circles and circles of acquaintances and good colleagues and so on and so forth in such a way that these circles are supporting the democratic state and not working against that. This is very much the question, by the way, also of Italian mafia. I do not know much about that, but there is a question, this is very close, Soprano scenario, very close circle of people who are kept together by very high mutual trust. And that's why it's so extremely effective. But in order to make the, let's say, liberal democratic state, it's not necessary to break these relations, but it's very important to canalize this trust into the trust to the democratic state. So this, to my view, this is important if we are talking about these kind of networks still existing in Eastern European democracies.
Viktor Misano said that these informal circles or circles of exchange substituted or were a substitute to public. So my question to all of you is, how has the public changed from then to now?
From when?
From Soviet times, socialist times to now.
I mean, it's extremely diverse. This is, I think that many of these Eastern European societies haven't understood it themselves that at the very end of the Soviet era, we were very much equal. This kind of worker and peasant country where everybody is basically equal, both in economic terms and so on and so forth, and in kind of ideological outlook sometimes too. What we are right now, we are very diverse, and I would say that the Western influence, what was mentioned by Viktor, is extremely important, but I wouldn't look at it as something negative, because there are very few purely original things in the social world. Of course, we take some practices and some social skills from our Western partners, which is a kind of a cultural transfer which has very often happened in the human history.
Well, if I can remark from my side, well, I would say that the new form of public, which is established nowadays, is minimum in, of course, not in Baltic countries, which are just part of the European community, but in other part of the former Soviet Union. First of all, in Russia. From my point of view, the basic difference I just mentioned before. It's a combination between private and public. So it means that it's a power which is very much based on capacity to do strong decisions, but in the same time keeping the certain forms of private enterprise. It's able to satisfy all this deficit of object of consume, which was crucially typical for the Soviet time. So in reality, this combination, thanks for this combination, atomization of, let's say, post-Soviet society was blocked. New poorness, which practically covered entire population in the 90s, was also solved in some way, and demands for consume, for let's say, capitalist way to enjoy consumerism was satisfied, and fidelity to power was also re-established, but not thanks for democratical procedures, but thanks for another form of association of people throughout procedures of trauma, pointing to trauma, historical trauma, unity of nation, which it seemed to us in the 90s, it's something old-fashioned, was immediately re-established and consolidated.
Also die Frage war, wie der Begriff Öffentlichkeit sich, wusste jetzt nicht genau, wie Sie es meinen, sich verändert hat. Also ich meine, es hat sich wahnsinnig viel verändert. Ich habe eher den Eindruck, dass zu Beginn nach der Wende es einen enormen Nachholbedarf nach Konsum und Konsumgütern gab. War ja auch so. Ja, und die Ostdeutschen gar keine Rolle mehr gespielt haben, sondern dann ist man nur die Produkte aus dem Westen erstmal gekauft haben. Teilen waren sie besser, in Teilen nicht, aber es war einfach der Bedarf da. Aber ich glaube, ich habe Ihre Frage nicht wirklich verstanden. Das kann ich ja mal zugeben. Ne?
Okay. Also Viktor Misano hatte die These aufgestellt, dass im Grunde genommen diese informellen Tauschzirkel ein Ersatz waren für Öffentlichkeit oder ein Gegenüber von Öffentlichkeit. Und Öffentlichkeit ist ja ein sehr ambivalenter Begriff in der Sowjetunion gewesen. Ist es in Russland heute anders, aber wieder auch, würde ich sagen. Und die Frage wäre aus Ihrer Perspektive, wie das in Ostdeutschland war, wenn man den Bogen macht zu heute. Aber Sie müssen auch nicht auf jede Frage antworten, wenn Sie nicht
möchten. Ich kann dazu nichts Schlaues sagen, ehrlich gesagt.
Okay. So, as I understood, all of you are quite skeptical towards the idea of sharing economy, let's say how it's discussed today still. Would you see some ideas of the old sharing economies or the old sharing in socialist times, which could be an interesting model for today? So, I mean, let's try to think what might be a positive idea which could be used or reused today. And not importing old ideas or re-importing Western ideas which actually come from here, but vice versa, turn it around. So that would be my last question before we then open to the audience.
Ja, ein Punkt war natürlich so, dass wir eine enorme Ressourcenknappheit hatten. Und diese Ressourcenknappheit hat zu sehr viel Wiederverwendung geführt. Also man hat einfach Sachen nicht so weggeschmissen, sondern alles quasi wiederverwendet und auch neue Anwendungen von Produkten her, die da waren, gefunden, auf die man sonst wahrscheinlich gar nicht gekommen wäre. Und das findet sich so ein bisschen auch in dem Leitgedanken der Nachhaltigkeit jetzt wieder, den wir jetzt ja alle predigen. Da war es aber einfach nicht aufgrund des Preises oder der staatlichen Vorgabe, sondern weil es das Zeug einfach nicht gab. Also von Papier, Glas und so weiter angefangen, über andere Dinge. Ansonsten glaube ich, dass man so ein bisschen was wieder sieht. Ich habe das vorhin mit den Gärten gemeint. Ich habe Freunde in Berlin, die sich eben so eine Garten jetzt teilen. Ja? Und das anbauen, wobei die vor 10 Jahren also wirklich niemals in so eine Kleingartenanlage gegangen wären, weil das nicht hip gewesen wäre, um sich dort die Wochenenden zu verbringen und Grünzeug, also Tomaten und sowas anzubauen. Und das kommt schon, das sehe ich zumindest, dass diese Form von gemeinschaftlicher Erfahrung und auch Teilen, ja, also das macht man nicht allein, sondern es ist dann vielleicht doch zu viel Arbeit, sondern teilt sich das dann ein, dass das wiederkommt. Ich weiß nicht, ob das spezifisch ostdeutsch ist oder anders auch nicht, aber das ist zumindest etwas, was sich wiederholt.
I would agree with what Mr. Schneider said in the sense that sharing is very important for survival, without any doubt, in all these regions. I am coming from a country which suffered the hardest until the 2009 economic crisis. We lost about a fifth of our GDP in 2009, 2010. And of course, all these survival practices like gardens, like different kinds of exchange of things, and so on and so forth, came back immediately because we had this experience during the 1990s. But still, I wouldn't say that this is a type of sharing which is included in the very term sharing economy, as for example, Jeremy Rifkin is talking about that, because this is very much about this value change, Wertewandel, which is very much about this post-material values coming back, like self-expression, environment, and so on and so forth. So survival as a motivation for sharing is not the same as all these kind of post-industrial, post-modern values, which are very popular in countries like Germany, US, UK, and so on and so forth. So there is still very much a difference in the social values.
Thank you. Viktor, what's the situation in Russia and the actual economic crisis Russia is in? So how is sharing seen there?
Well, yes. Yes, this issue became again very much up to date, but it became even before very up to date. If to answer to your initial question, I would say that I feel a necessity of the return of common in two senses, in two dimensions, in two spheres. First of all, in my personal professional sphere, because yes, idea of communism, of communism became very fashionable topic in artistic bohème. In artistic circle, it became very fashionable, and if you are not doing exhibition or art piece about communism, no chance, first of all, for the success in the West. And this is crucially important. And what I would reprove to my colleagues, to artists, to all those who are very active in the art field and who is claiming, for more democratical, more communist form of behavior, it's that they're only claiming but not behaving. They're talking about common value, but they're not building communities. They're not creating alternative forms of life. They're remaining dependent on different foundations, private foundations established by oligarchs. They're still depending on different projects organized by the state. Anyway, I mean, definitely their career, their life in art, it's dependent from that. But they're absolutely ignoring possibility to create an alternative, their own alternative space, which would guarantee them collective alternative platform, or is minimum another dimension, or is minimum another form of life, shared with other forms of life. So this is the first point. The second point is I can mention that in early in 2011, 2012, as it is quite known, a very strong wave of mass protest became a fact of social and political reality in Russia. And there is a lot of Alexander Bigbov, sociologist from Moscow. He has done incredibly interesting research about these collective experiences. And he also pointed many forms of collective solidarity, of really collective enjoyment of being together. But what I honestly could reprove to all those who were around me in these collective manifestations on the square of Moscow, it's that in reality, their collectivism was very limited. All of them, they're mostly wealthy people, middle class, involved in in intellectual production, but also in different form of creative productions. And they were enjoying on being together, because in this collective enjoyment, they were also enjoying the fact that they are not others. We are together because we are well-dressed, because we speak English, because we are traveling, because we're successful. And we are not satisfied with everything what surrounds me. This is collective activity, but this is totally contradicts my understanding on communism.
Okay, thank you. So quite skeptical views on, well, communism, and also sharing. What I learned actually is that the idea of sustainability could be within the idea of sharing, which could be worthwhile to try to bridge to today. So I'd like to open up to the public. We have some 10 minutes left, so if there are any questions, please go ahead. We need microphones for the translation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, the panelists. My name is Tatiana Barchunova. I'm from the region that Viktor Misano has been talking about. I'm from Novosibirsk. I'm not sure people know what Novosibirsk is. It's a big industrial city in Russia, but it's not only this industrial giant, as we call it under the Soviet regime, but it's also the source of a very interesting trend, which, from my point of view, is slightly different from Ushakin's perspective on trauma and Yurchak's opposition of this Soviet system to the current situation. And I find it a very interesting trend, especially because Novosibirsk is a sort of like a stadium, a platform, a model for these new trends in the correlation between public and private. And this correlation is like this, that Novosibirsk produces, as it is a huge intellectual center, besides being an industrial center, it produces lots of private projects that the government appropriates. So the government used to suppress everything which was, the semi-public, which is Drama Maslova and Voronov described. But now, what the government does, it appropriates the private initiatives that has been produced. And Novosibirsk produced several cases of this. One of them is the so-called monstration. I'm sure that Viktor Misano has heard about it. It is like, a sort of a youth carnival monster, monstration. And it's a public march with absolutely absurd slogans. And so the government is trying. So what the government does, and it was a private initiative of a very small artistic youth. Some of them were my students. This is why I'm familiar with the very roots of the movement. So the government is trying to appropriate it as a youth politics instrument. When they fail, they try to cancel it. Right? Then there was a very famous, within the framework of Russia, movement which is called Immortal Detachment, which is partly about trauma, but not so much about trauma, but about family history. It's like, a movement which tries to restore the names of those who died and suffered in war, but also people who were, like, regular soldiers, regular workers, industrial workers, peasants, everyone who was doing something positive during the war, not only dying as a hero. And then there was a movement which is somehow, which is a bit controversial, therefore I'm not going to talk about it. But those are two cases when the government tries to make these private initiatives a public governmental instruments of political influence. So that's my point.
Okay, thank you. That was more commentary.
Yeah, but that was not a question.
But maybe you would like to...
You added a very, very precise remark. I totally agree with you. Yes, if we have to, in fact, you added to my answer to Astrid's question about new public. Yes, new public, it's not repressive, monotonously repressive as, but this new public, it's able, it's more elastic, more smart, it's able to use different forms spontaneously produced by the population, use it for their own propagandistic goals, so yes, we are not living anymore in a disciplinary society, but in a society of control, as sustaining many philosophers. And I would say this is one of this example of the difference between society of control and society of discipline.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ebert would like to ask a question.
Also ich habe eine Frage, es wurde der Begriff Nostalgie angesprochen, also die Rückbesinnung auf die DDR oder die Sowjetunion. Wie stark ist diese Nostalgie noch und wie stark ist sie mit diesen Phänomenen verbunden, wo über Teilen auch eine persönliche Beziehung hergestellt wird? Oder ist es eher eine politische Nostalgie?
Also politisch, glaube ich, ist sie gar nicht. Also die DDR zurückhaben wollen vom politischen System her, wollen nur die ganz Harten, aber das sind nicht mehr viele, sondern es ist mehr eine der Sicherheit. Also eben sich keinen Kopf machen zu müssen über Jobverlust und sonstige Unsicherheiten, die halt ein kapitalistisches System mit sich bringt. Und natürlich ein Teil einer Verklärung. In der Vergangenheit war immer, also man vergisst das Schlechte und erinnert sich an das Gute. Und genau wie diese privaten Beziehungen, über die wir vorhin ja auch schon gesprochen haben, verklärt werden. Die Leute waren so viel beieinander, weil sie auch nicht so viel arbeiten mussten. Ja, also meine Mutter hat im Kombinat gearbeitet, um 6 angefangen, um 7:30 hatte sie nichts mehr zu tun, weil keine Ersatzteile mehr da waren. Und man hatte dann eben viel Zeit. Ja? Also Zeit war im massigen Umfang da und man konnte ja auch nicht so weit weg. Also man war ja gefangen in diesem Nukleus hier. Zumindest außerhalb von nach Tschechoslowakei ging es noch. Also ich glaube, das ist mehr die Verklärung des Ganzen. Es hat weniger was mit der Realität zu tun.
Ich glaube, diese Frage ist eigentlich sehr interessant in dem Sinne, ob wir dann über die sozusagen emotionale Dimension sprechen, und die ist, ich glaube, überall relativ verbreitet. Oder ob wir dann von einer sozusagen öffentlichen Repräsentation dieser Nostalgie reden kann. Und in den baltischen Ländern ist natürlich keine kulturelle Nostalgie möglich, weil das ist sehr stark mit einer negativen Bewertung des sowjetischen Regimes verbunden. Was zum Beispiel für die Tschechei nicht gilt. Und ich glaube auch für Ostdeutschland, hier man sieht relativ viele von diesen sozusagen romantisch kitschigen Unternehmen, die etwas aus diesem DDR-Erbe machen. Aber in den baltischen Ländern ist es viel strenger, weil wir haben natürlich diese Dimension mit der sowjetischen Okkupation, die wirklich eine sehr große spielt. Also das ist unterschiedlich. Ja.
Well, listening to you, I had an impulse also to speak in German, but I need as minimum 1 day more in Weimar to recuperate my German. I am nostalgic, and I'm not ashamed at all because of that. If I'm nostalgic, it means that I'm unsatisfied with something in the present. And this is, from my point of view, a big resource of transformation and of active inactivity in, let's say, for the future. Obviously, nostalgia could be reactionary. But still it could be progressive. In fact, 10 years ago, I realized 4 big exhibitions in the frame of my project in different cities in Europe, and the title of the project was Progressive Nostalgia. And in fact, I involved many artists also from Latvia, also from Baltic countries, till Kyrgyzia, Kazakhstan. I covered the whole post-Soviet space, inviting different artists of different, now different countries to reflect our former common country, its impulse, its resources, and experience of, let's say, post-Soviet period. So, and in reality, the real value of common could really come from reflection and rehabilitation of our past, which was, from my point of view, very fastly annihilated, very fastly erased, and fastly erased because of a pure political reason, because of the reason of power, because to justify absolutely absurd criminal privatization, to justify new authoritarianism, you can only erasing the certain past, but only recuperating another past to which people are also nostalgic. So in reality, power, it's always manipulating with nostalgia. But for example, if I can mention you what I'm nostalgic about, you mentioned this so-called communal apartment in which people were obliged to live together. Yeah, I don't know if audience, which is, I see many young faces, perhaps you don't know what does it mean. It means big apartments in which in pre-communist time lived, let's say, very wealthy family. Yeah, in post-Soviet time were inhabited by 5 families, for example. And it's happened to me to live 1 year of my life just in post-Soviet time in such an apartment. And well, I'm very nostalgic of that period of my life because I was in love with the person with whom I was living in this apartment. But she grew up in it. And her father was very active in dissident movement. And other families which used to live close, near, who knew everything about what he was doing, because they noticed people who were coming, they noticed police car all the time in front of the house. They were absolutely conscious about what was happening in this family. They never ever done any information to, let's say, to secret services. They never knocked the door of a car, which was mostly all the time staying in front of the house. And when police came, and when father of my recent wife was also arrested, all these people, very Soviet, very fidel, helped them a lot. Really practically helped them a lot. So this form of solidarity, we never talked about that in the course of our common discussion today. How this anthropological dimension created an alternative to public, sometimes even imposed by public. In reality, we are very conscious about that this is another space where public should not enter, and that other laws, other forms of relations, and another ethic is governing. Well, this is something, from my point of view, which we missed and which we are not recuperated yet, and I'm really very nostalgic about that.
That's a very positive view on Kommunalkas. I'm not sure everybody shares this point of view, but it's interesting to hear. So, with you on the watch, wir haben noch eine letzte Frage.
Thank you. This will be maybe more of a reflection on this conference and other conferences that we actually go to. Like you mentioned, we are successful with travel. We share these opinions, and everywhere you hear this term shared economy, everybody tells you it's Airbnb and Uber, and that is where usually we stop, because we cannot mention much more, maybe co-working spaces. Yep. And from what I hear is actually we share a lot. Like all our lives we share. Most of it is actually informal and unpaid work. And then we refer to this term shared economy. What is shared economy exactly? Is it Airbnb and one other product? And then again, like, can it be monetized? I mean, what's the proportion to, let's say, classical economy? Just not to have an impression like this is the future. I mean, can shared economy be a future for us? Can it be successful in applying? Because otherwise we would have to, monetize everything that we do, which would require a different system of thinking. I mean, so maybe that is a question, like, how do you understand this term shared economy, and if it can be future for us?
Would you like to answer? I think you already started at the beginning.
Ja, das ist eine Frage, die ich mir auch stelle. I don't know. Maybe, we'll see. Ich finde, man sollte das nicht aufhalten. Wenn Individuen sich dafür entscheiden, bestimmte Güter miteinander zu teilen, dann sollen sie es tun. Ja? Und es gibt Dinge, die man auch aus einem übergeordneten staatlichen Interesse unterstützt, wie das Carsharing. Macht einfach Sinn, weil dass man diese viele Autos auf der Straße stehen hat, indem wir da besondere Parkplätze genehmigen und. Aber das ist nichts, was ich sagen würde, was wir besonders vorantreiben. Das entsteht. Niemand von uns hat ja das sich überlegt, welche Produkte oder Dienstleistungen mit dem Internet verbunden sind. Und ich lese das auch und ich sehe das. Und mit dem Industrie 4.0 gibt es eine große Debatte. Wie viel Arbeit gibt es überhaupt noch in der Zukunft? Kann einmal Sozialdemokraten dann auch Angst machen, aber die Zukunft kommt. Der Fortschritt kommt, die Leute werden sich daran anpassen und wir werden gucken, wie wir damit umgehen müssen. Und da, wo es klug ist, es auch fördern, aber jedenfalls keine Steine in den Weg legen, solange es nicht dazu führt, Uber war so ein Beispiel und auch Airbnb, wo man dann sehr genau aufpassen muss, ob es nicht andere öffentliche Güter benachteiligt. Bei Airbnb ist das der Fall. In Berlin zum Beispiel, wo es eine Wohnungsknappheit gibt und ganz viele Wohnungen einfach nur noch so für die Tagestouristen, die da einfliegen, zur Verfügung stehen und dementsprechend nicht mehr für die Leute, die da wohnen. Und deswegen es eine Regulierung gibt. Das finde ich dann auch richtig, da zu regulieren. Ich finde, man muss aufpassen. Die Europäische Kommission hat heute auch eine Verordnungsvorgaben gemacht, wie man damit umgehen kann. Das ist noch ein bisschen unsicheres Terrain und ich beobachte das genauso.
Thank you. So, I think there was one last question. If not, I'd like to thank all of you for your contribution and the very interesting discussion. Vielen Dank an das Publikum für die Fragen and thank you very much. Vielen Dank.